The water was up to Albert Atkins's chest when he realized he was going to die. Not slowly, not peacefully, not in some blaze of glory that the dime novels back east like to romanticize. He was going to sink into the Louisiana border swamp mud of the Cypress Flats like a stone dropped into a well, and the last sound he would ever hear would be the distant laughter of the men he had been chasing for 3 weeks across 400 miles of the most brutal frontier terrain in the American South. He had taken the wrong channel. He knew it the moment the water went from waist-deep to chest-deep in the space of 3 steps, and he knew it even more certainly when he felt the thick, sucking pull of the bog beneath the dark water trying to swallow his boots whole. His horse, Copper, had already turned back. Even the animal had better sense than he did. The badges sewn into the lawman's pocket meant nothing out here. The warrant he carried in his oilskin pouch meant nothing. The loaded Colt revolver on his hip was useless against quicksand and swamp gas and the absolute, suffocating darkness of a cypress forest at dusk. He had heard of the trapper woman. Every man who had passed through Sulphur Creek had mentioned her name in the same breath they used for dangerous things. Sarah Dawson, lives alone in the Cypress Flats, knows every inch of the swamp like she grew up from the mud itself. Do not make her angry. Do not touch her traps, and for God's sake, do not ride into the flats without her permission. He had ignored every single piece of that advice. And now he was standing chest-deep in black water, with the current of a hidden underwater channel pulling at his legs like a cold, patient hand, and the cypress trees above him were turning the purple dusk sky into thin, barely visible strips of light between their moss-draped branches. "You are going to stop moving right now." The voice came from behind him, sharp, low, controlled, not a shout but the kind of voice that carried absolute authority even when it barely rose above a conversational tone. Albert froze, every muscle in his body locked. "I mean it," the voice said. "Every time you shift your weight, you sink another half-inch. The channel you are standing in runs 8 feet deep 6 steps to your left. You take one more step in the direction you were heading and you will not come back up, so do not move." He turned his head slowly, fighting every instinct that told him to thrash and fight and push toward solid ground. She was standing on a cypress root that jutted out over the water, barely visible in the dying light. A woman, maybe 26 or 27 years old, dressed in leather breeches and a rough canvas jacket, her dark hair pulled back under a wide-brimmed hat, a long pole balanced in one hand with the practiced ease of someone who had been using it since childhood. Her eyes, even in the dim light, were sharp and calculating and completely without fear. She was looking at him the way an experienced surgeon looks at a patient who has done something catastrophically stupid to themselves, not with cruelty, not with mockery, with precise, detached assessment. "Sarah Dawson," he said. His voice came out steadier than he felt. "Deputy," she replied, "I know who you are. The entire county has been waiting for you to get yourself killed in my swamp." She lifted the pole and extended the far end toward him. "Take the end of this and do not pull. Just hold it and let me guide you. Lean slightly back, keep your weight off your left leg, and trust the pole." He wanted to argue. He wanted to tell her he could manage on his own. He wanted to say something that would reestablish whatever shred of dignity a man can claim when he is chin-deep in swamp water at the mercy of a woman he has never met. He took the pole. She guided him out in less than 90 seconds. Precise, efficient instructions. Shift right, lean back, lift the left foot, step toward her voice. By the time he dragged himself up onto a moss-covered bank and collapsed to his knees, gasping, mud-soaked, and humbled in a way he had never been humbled before, she was already standing 3 feet away, watching him with that same surgical patience. "Thank you," he managed. "Do not thank me yet," Sarah Dawson said. "You came into my swamp unauthorized. You probably ruined half a dozen of my trap lines, and the men you are chasing killed one of my deer runs 2 days ago when they came through. So you and I have a great deal to discuss before you get to be grateful." Albert Atkins had been a deputy United States Marshal for 7 years. He had tracked outlaws across the Mojave, ridden into Apache territory, and once talked down a man with a shotgun in a crowded saloon without drawing his weapon. He was 31 years old, 6 feet 2 inches tall, and had never in his life felt as thoroughly out of his element as he did at that moment, sitting in the mud at the edge of the Cypress Flats, looking up at a woman who was clearly the most capable and frankly terrifying person he had met in a very long time. He would think about that moment for a long time afterward. The exact shape of the light on the water, the sound of the frogs beginning their evening chorus, the way she looked standing on that root, completely at home in a place that had nearly killed him. But that was later. Right now, 3 weeks earlier, it had all started in a town called Millhaven, Texas, with a telegram and a murder and a set of tracks heading southeast into the worst terrain in the American Southwest. Millhaven was not a prosperous town. It sat at the edge of the Sabine River country in East Texas, close enough to the Louisiana border that the culture had a layered quality to it, part frontier, part southern, part something older and stranger that the cypress trees and the Spanish moss seemed to breathe into the air. The people who lived there were tough, practical, and generally minded their own business with the focused intensity of people who had learned that their business was hard enough without borrowing anyone else's trouble. Albert Atkins had ridden into Millhaven on a Tuesday afternoon in September of 1882, following the trail of the Calloway brothers. 3 of them, the oldest being Randall Calloway, who was 35 and wanted for murder, bank robbery, and a spectacular train robbery outside of Fort Worth that had killed 2 postal inspectors and a conductor. The middle brother, Dennis, was 31 and wanted for the same charges plus a separate assault in Beaumont. The youngest, Tyler Calloway, was 24 and the only one who had not technically killed anyone yet, though he had been present for every crime his brothers committed and had made no apparent effort to stop any of it. They had been heading southeast for a month, and every lawman who tried to follow them into the Cypress Flats had turned back. The flats were a massive stretch of bayou and swamp country that ran along the Texas-Louisiana border, impenetrable to anyone who did not know the waterways. The Calloways had apparently found themselves a local guide at some point because they had vanished into the flats like smoke in wind, and the local sheriff, a thick-necked man named Horace Prout, had informed Albert flatly that nobody went into the Cypress Flats uninvited. "Nobody except Sarah Dawson," said the old man who ran the feed store, speaking up from behind a barrel of dried corn. "She knows the flats like nobody else. Her daddy was a trapper, his daddy before him. She has been living out there alone for 6 years since her daddy passed. Knows every waterway, every solid ground patch, every quicksand pool. If them Calloway boys are hiding in the flats, she is the only person alive who could find them." "Then I need to speak with her," Albert said. Silence fell over the feed store with the weight of a dropped stone. "Son," said Sheriff Prout, in a tone that suggested he was being very, very patient, "the last man who went to Sarah Dawson's place without permission walked out of the flats 2 days later barefoot, missing his horse and his hat, and refusing to describe exactly what happened. She does not welcome visitors. I am a Deputy United States Marshal," Albert said, "not a visitor. I have a warrant for 3 dangerous men, and I have reason to believe they are in that swamp." "I wish you luck," said the old man at the feed store, and he did not sound like he meant it. Albert had spent the rest of that day gathering what information he could about the Cypress Flats and about Sarah Dawson. What he found was a picture that was more complicated and more interesting than he had expected. She had come to the flats as a young girl with her father, Ezekiel Dawson, who had been a trapper and naturalist of some local reputation. Her mother had died when Sarah was 8, and Ezekiel had raised her alone in the swamp, teaching her everything he knew. By the time she was 16, the local Creole trappers who worked the edges of the flats were already saying she knew the waterways better than any of them. When Ezekiel died of fever 6 years ago, Sarah had simply stayed. She sold furs and hides in Millhaven twice a year, traded medicinal herbs with the doctor, and otherwise had as little to do with the town as possible. There were darker stories, too. Stories about the flats themselves, about hidden dangers and unseen currents, about the way the land shifted and changed with the seasons, flooding new channels and closing old ones. Sarah Dawson was said to have a map in her head that was more accurate than any surveyor's chart. She was also said to be extraordinarily protective of what she considered her territory, and several men who had come into the flats looking to trap or hunt without her permission had come out considerably worse for the encounter. What struck Albert most, as he sat in the dusty little boarding house that evening eating salt pork and cornbread and thinking about his situation, was not the warning about her temper. It was the detail about her knowledge. He had been tracking outlaws for 7 years, and he understood in his bones the critical importance of terrain. The man who understood the ground beneath his feet held every advantage. The Calloway brothers had that advantage right now. They were sitting somewhere in the flats, probably laughing at the idea of any lawman following them in. He needed Sarah Dawson, and from everything he had heard, getting Sarah Dawson's help was going to require a very different approach than the one he typically used when dealing with reluctant witnesses. He left at first light the next morning, before the town was fully awake. He had gotten rough directions from the feed store owner, who had clearly decided that if a federal marshal was determined to get himself killed, that was between the marshal and God. The directions involved following the main river trail south for 6 miles, then taking a fork marked by a split cypress tree, then following what the old man described as the smell of good wood smoke and bad attitude, until he found her cabin. It took him 3 hours. The trail into the flats was barely a trail at all, more of a suggestion of one, a series of slightly flattened grass patches and bent branches that a man needed a particular kind of eye to follow. Copper, his roan gelding, was nervous the entire way, ears flat, hooves picking carefully at the soft ground. The air changed as they went deeper, becoming cooler and damper, heavy with the smell of water and rot and the strange, sweet odor of cypress bark. Spanish moss draped everything. The cypress trees grew so thick that by mid-morning the light was already dim and greenish, filtered through 100 layers of branch and leaf. He smelled the wood smoke before he saw the cabin. Then he saw the traps. They were everywhere once he knew to look for them. Leg-holed traps, spring-loaded, hidden under shallow water and leaf litter, marked only by the faintest signs that a trained eye could read, and that a careless man would walk right through. He stopped Copper and dismounted, studying the ground carefully. There was a path through them, he could see that much, a series of safe stepping stones marked by almost invisible signs, a bent twig here, a scratch on a cypress root there. He was still standing there, working it out, when the click of a hammer being pulled back echoed through the quiet air behind his left ear. "You are reading the markers," said a voice, the same sharp, controlled voice he would hear again 3 weeks later, pulling him out of the swamp. "Most people just walk in and hit the first trap inside 20 feet. How do you know what to look for?" He turned very slowly, because when someone has a gun behind your ear, turning slowly is the only reasonable choice. She was standing 6 feet away, holding a Henry rifle with the comfortable, thoughtless ease of someone who had been shooting, since before Albert was old enough to carry a weapon. Up close, she was striking in a way that had nothing to do with conventional prettiness, and everything to do with a kind of fierce, angular intelligence that seemed to inhabit her entire face. Her eyes were dark hazel, sharp as the traps she set, and currently fixed on him with an expression that was somewhere between curiosity and flat warning. "I was a scout before I was a marshal," he said. "You learned to read country." Something flickered in those eyes. Not warmth exactly, but a kind of recalibration, as though she had been expecting one thing and gotten another. "State your business," she said, and the rifle did not lower. "I need your help," Albert said. He did not preface it or soften it or bury it in official language. He had thought about how to approach this conversation for 3 hours on horseback, and he had decided that the only approach that had any chance of working with a woman like Sarah Dawson was pure, unvarnished honesty. "I am Albert Atkins, Deputy United States Marshal out of the Fort Worth Division. I am tracking 3 wanted men who have hidden themselves in the Cypress Flats. I am told that you know the flats better than any person alive, and I am here to ask if you will guide me through to find them." She looked at him for a long moment. The frogs called somewhere in the distance. A heron lifted silently from a pool 30 feet to his left. "Who told you I know the flats better than any person alive?" she said. "Essentially everyone in Millhaven," he said, another flicker in those eyes. This time it might have been amusement, though it was gone too quickly to be certain. "Deputy Atkins," she said, "in the 6 years I have lived alone out here, I have had 2 federal marshals, 1 county sheriff, 3 bounty hunters, and 1 very confused newspaper reporter from New Orleans show up at my door asking for my help. Do you know what all of them had in common? I assume they did not ask nicely," he said. "They did not ask at all," she said. "They told me what they needed, and they assumed that a federal badge was sufficient to compel me to provide it. I am not a government employee, Deputy Atkins. I do not owe the marshal's office my time or my knowledge or my safety. And the Cypress Flats is not federal territory, it is my home, and I have worked very hard to make it one that other people stay out of." "I understand that," he said, and then because he felt it was the most important thing he could say and because he meant it completely, he said, "I am asking, not telling, and if the answer is no, I will leave your property and I will not come back." The rifle lowered an inch, just an inch, but it was something. "Tell me about these men," she said. He told her everything. The Calloway brothers, the bank robbery in Fort Worth, the 2 postal inspectors, and the conductor who had died on the train. He told her about the 3 weeks of trailing them across East Texas, about the local guide they had apparently found, about the certainty that they were somewhere in the flats, and the equal certainty that without local knowledge no lawman was ever going to find them. He watched her face as he talked. She was listening, genuinely listening, not just waiting for him to finish. Her expression did not change much, but those sharp eyes moved occasionally as though she was processing information against some internal map. When he finished, she said, "The local guide they found. Did anyone describe him?" "Young man, maybe 20 years old, local Creole family. Name of Petty, apparently. Lives on the south edge of the flats." Her expression went very still in a particular way. "Armand Petty," she said. "You know him. He is 17 years old," she said, and her voice had changed, the professional detachment replaced with something that had edges to it. "His family uses the South Channels for their own trap lines. If those men are using Armand as a guide, they are using him under threat. Armand Petty would not willingly help criminals." She paused. "That changes things." She studied him for a moment longer, and he had the very distinct sensation of being comprehensively assessed, not just physically, though he was aware that she was doing that too, but somehow more completely than that. As though she was reading him the way she read the terrain, looking for markers, reading the signs. "I am not your subordinate and I am not your prisoner," she said. "If I guide you through the flats, we do this on my terms. I choose the route, I choose the pace. I make the decisions about how we approach these men and how we handle any situation that arises in my swamp. You are a capable man in open country, I have no doubt. In the flats, you are a liability until I tell you otherwise. If you cannot agree to those terms, ride back to Millhaven." "Agreed," he said without hesitation. She looked at him as though she was waiting for him to add qualifications or conditions or the inevitable, within reason, that men usually appended when they were agreeing to something they did not fully intend to honor. He did not add anything. "Come inside," she said. "I will make coffee and we will plan." He tied copper to a pine at the edge of the safe path, following her markers now with more confidence, and he followed Sarah Dawson into her cabin. It was not what he had expected. He was not sure what he had expected. Something rough and minimal, perhaps, the bare necessities of a solitary life. What he found was a space that was compact but intensely organized and unexpectedly rich in information. Every wall had something on it: maps, charts, sketches, what looked like botanical drawings of swamp plants. There was a bookshelf that held more volumes than he would have thought possible to accumulate out here: natural history, surveying texts, what looked like several French-language volumes. A large work table had a map spread across it, hand-drawn, extraordinarily detailed, covered in notations in a small, precise handwriting. He stood in the middle of this space and felt the full weight of his own prior assumptions sitting heavily on his conscience. He had known, intellectually, from what people had said, that Sarah Dawson was exceptionally capable. But knowing and seeing were very different things. She had built something extraordinary out here, not just a shelter. A center of knowledge, a working archive of the flats, years and years of careful observation and documentation translated into something that was, he realized as he looked more carefully at those maps, genuinely more comprehensive and accurate than anything the government surveyors had produced. "You mapped the whole flats," he said. "Yes," she said matter-of-factly, pouring water from a bucket into an iron pot and hanging it over the fire. "The government surveyors tried for 2 years and gave up, said the terrain was too unstable." "The terrain is very unstable," she said. "That is why the map is constantly being updated. I mark the date of each observation. A channel that is passable in September may be submerged by November. You have to understand the system, not just the snapshot." She nodded toward the map on the table. "Come look." He came. She stood beside him at the table, close enough that he could smell wood smoke and pine resin, and she explained the map to him the way a general explains a battlefield. Here were the main channels, here were the seasonally flooded areas, here were the quicksand zones that shifted with the water table, here were the patches of high ground where a group of men could make a permanent camp. She pointed to 3 possible locations with the tip of a pencil. If they came in from the north with Armand Petty, they would have used the Petty family channels here. Those lead to either the high shelf here or the island grounds here, about 6 miles south. The high shelf is higher and drier but has no fresh water source. The island grounds have a spring. If they plan to stay more than 3 days, they are at the island grounds. Albert looked at the map. At the detail, the notations, the seasonal markers. At 6 years of solitary, meticulous, brilliant work laid out in front of him. "This is extraordinary," he said, and he meant it in the full, unqualified sense of the word. She glanced at him sideways, and this time he saw clearly what flickered in those eyes. Not vanity about the compliment, something quieter and more complex. The look of someone who had done excellent work in complete isolation for a very long time and had largely forgotten what it felt like to have it acknowledged. "It is useful," she said, in a tone that closed the subject without rudeness. "Now, the island grounds are accessible by 3 routes. 2 of them you would not survive without me. The third is longer but manageable if I guide you. We will take the third." She poured the coffee and they spent the next 2 hours planning. He asked questions and she answered them, and the questions he asked were good ones, operationally precise, thinking about approach angles and visibility and the behavior of men who felt they were safely hidden, and he watched her respect for him quietly, incrementally notch upward as the conversation went on. He was not asking the right questions to impress her. He was asking them because they were the right questions to ask. That was something she could tell the difference between, and it mattered to her in a way she did not fully examine yet. They left at dawn the next morning. She had given him specific instructions about what to bring and what to leave: no spurs. The sound carries over water, good boots that he did not mind ruining, the least amount of gear possible, because in the flats weight was a liability. He had followed all of it without argument, which surprised her, because in her limited but formative experience, men with badges generally believed that their authority extended to telling other people how to do their own jobs. Albert Atkins did not behave that way. He watched, he listened, he asked before he acted. When she showed him how to read the channel markers she had placed throughout the safe routes, He paid close attention and he remembered them. When she told him to stop, he stopped. When she told him to move, he moved. On that first day they covered about 3 miles of what she estimated would be a 12-mile route to the island grounds. 3 miles does not sound like much, but 3 miles through the Cypress Flats is a full day's work. The terrain was constantly changing, solid ground giving way to shallow water giving way to deeper channels, the channels weaving and branching in ways that made every fork a decision point. She moved through it with the fluid, economical confidence of long practice, never hesitating, always 2 steps ahead of the ground beneath her feet. He watched her with the focused attention of someone trying to learn as fast as possible, and he was honest enough with himself to acknowledge that he was also watching her, the way a man watches a woman when something about her has caught in his chest like a hook. That evening they made camp on a patch of high ground she knew, a cypress root shelf about 3 feet above the waterline with enough dry moss to sleep on. She built a fire so small and so smokeless that he barely believed it was there, until he held his hands over it and felt the warmth. She produced dried venison and hard cornbread from her pack, and they ate in the quiet that the swamp produced at night, which was not silence exactly, but a kind of organized noise, frogs and night birds, and the occasional splash of something large moving through water somewhere nearby. "How long have you been a marshal?" she asked, and it was the first personal question she had asked him since they met. 7 years, he said. Before that I scouted for the Army for 4 years. Before that I was ranching in Kansas. Born in Ohio, raised on the frontier. He paused. "You, born in Millhaven," she said. "My mother died when I was 8. After that it was just my father and me." She said it without self-pity or sentimentality, just fact. "We moved into the flats when I was 12. My father believed the knowledge of places like this was disappearing. He wanted to document it before it was gone. He succeeded," Albert said, thinking of the maps. "He did the original work," she said. "I have been building on it." She poked at the tiny fire with a stick. "He died of river fever, 1876. A bad season. I was 20. You stayed." "It was home," she said, as though this was perfectly obvious and required no further explanation. He looked at her across the small fire, this woman who had made a home out of one of the most hostile environments in the American South, and had done it so thoroughly and so skillfully that the home had become something extraordinary. He felt the hook set a little deeper. "The men you mentioned," he said carefully, "who came to you before, the other marshals. What happened?" She looked at him steadily. "The first one threatened me when I refused to help him," she said. "He found himself turned around in the flats for 4 days before I let him find his way out. The second was more polite but made the mistake of assuming that my knowledge of the swamp was somehow less serious or legitimate than official surveying work. He went home empty-handed." A pause. "None of them asked. Not the way you did." "The asking matters," he said. "The asking matters enormously," she said, and there was something in her voice that made him think she was talking about more than just this situation. The second day took them deeper into the flats, through waterways that had no name on any official map, channels so narrow the cypress roots formed arches overhead, and the air tasted of standing water and old wood. She moved through these spaces like someone moving through a familiar house in the dark, confident and precise in a way that went beyond knowledge into something more physical and intuitive. It was on the second day that she showed him the thing that truly stopped him cold. They had come to a section where the main channel forked, and both branches looked identical to him. Dark water under gray-green cypress shadow, no distinguishable difference whatsoever. She stopped and he saw her tilt her head slightly, not looking at the water but at something in the air above it. "The right channel," she said quietly. "Something came through it recently. See the disturbance in the water lettuce there and there. Those rosettes are turned. Something bigger than an animal broke the surface within the last 12 hours. He looked. He could not see it. He was not too proud to say so. "Show me," he said. She did. She pointed out each marker, the turned plant rosettes, a faint silt cloud still hanging in the water of the right channel, the way the mud on a protruding cypress root had been slightly scraped, as though a flat-bottomed boat had been poled through. Each marker individually was almost nothing. Together they formed an unmistakable picture. "A boat came through here," he said, "heading toward the island grounds." "Early this morning," she said. "The silt cloud would have settled by now if it were older." He stared at the channel for a long moment. He had 7 years of tracking experience. He could read ground sign across open country with more skill than most. But this reading of water and floating plant life and the behavior of silt in still channels, this was something entirely different. This was knowledge built over years of the closest possible attention to a single, complex place, and he was seeing it in full operation for the first time, and it was, simply, magnificent. "Sarah," he said, and her name came out of his mouth in a tone that he had not entirely planned, something warmer and more direct than he had been using, and she turned to look at him. "What?" she said. "You are the most skilled person I have ever tracked with," he said, "and I have tracked with Apache scouts." She was very still for a moment. The frogs called in the distance. "There was a time when white men did not acknowledge that native knowledge had value," she said carefully. "There are men who still do not," he said. "I am not one of them, and I am not one of the men who would fail to acknowledge yours either." He held her gaze. "This is exceptional what you do, and I want you to know I see it." She looked at him for a long moment with an expression he could not entirely read, because it had several layers to it, and the layers seemed to be doing battle with each other. Then she turned back to the channel. "Stay close," she said. "From here we need to be quiet." They moved carefully through the right channel, and Albert Atkins kept his eyes and ears open, and his mouth shut, and thought about Sarah Dawson, and found that thinking about her was becoming a habit that he was not entirely sure he had the willpower to break. On the third day, they found Armand Petty. He was tied to a cypress tree at the edge of a small island, about a quarter-mile from the island grounds proper. He was perhaps 17, slight and dark-haired, with Creole features and the weathered look of someone who had grown up on the water. He was alive and physically unharmed, though he had clearly been there for at least a day, tied by his wrists to the tree above his head, feet just touching the ground. He had been used to guide the Callaways in and then kept as insurance, a hostage to prevent anyone from following. Sarah Dawson had known something like this might be the case. She had said so, quietly, the previous evening. When they found him, she moved toward him without hesitation, drawing her knife to cut the rope, and his eyes went wide. "Mademoiselle Dawson," he gasped. They said if anyone came they would kill me." "They do not know we are here yet," she said, cutting the rope with precise efficiency. "Can you walk?" "Yes," he said, then proved it by nearly falling over. Albert caught him. "He needs water," Sarah said. She produced a canteen. The boy drank gratefully. "Where are they?" Albert asked, keeping his voice low. Armand pointed. "Island grounds. There is a cabin there, an old trapper's cabin. My grandfather built it. They are all 3 there. They have guns, many guns. They know someone is looking for them, the oldest one, Randall. He is very watchful." He swallowed. "They have been arguing. The youngest one, Tyler, he does not want to be there. He said he wants to surrender. Randall hit him." Albert and Sarah exchanged a look. Information about fractures within the group was always useful. "Can you get back to the East Channel on your own?" Sarah asked Armand. "The route I showed your father last spring, do you know it?" "Yes," he said. "I know it." "Go," she said. "Do not stop. Get back to Millhaven and tell Sheriff Prout that Deputy Atkins is at the island grounds. He is to send men to the East Landing in 2 days. No sooner." Armand looked at her, then at Albert. Then he nodded and slipped away through the trees with the soundless ease of someone who had grown up in this country. Within 30 seconds there was no evidence he had been there at all. 2 days, Albert said. "We cannot take 3 armed men directly," she said calmly. "We have 1 rifle and your revolver between us. But if we can observe them for 2 days, I can identify the moments when their guard is down, and we can choose the optimal time for you to move on them." She paused. "Or we wait for the sheriff's men." Waiting 2 days with 3 armed men within a quarter-mile is not without risk, he said. Almost nothing in the flats is without risk, she said, with a tone that suggested this was so obvious it barely warranted saying. The question is always which risk is acceptable. He thought about this. You do not have to stay, he said. You have done what you agreed to. You guided me here. You could go back with Armand. She looked at him with an expression that was somewhere between offended and amused. And leave you alone in the Cypress Flats with 3 armed killers and no idea where the solid ground is, she said. Deputy Atkins, I have spent 6 years keeping people from dying in this swamp. I am not going to start letting them die now just because it would be technically acceptable for me to leave. He almost smiled at that. He did not, because the situation did not warrant smiling, but the almost smile was there. They spent the rest of that day finding a position from which they could observe the old trapper's cabin on the island grounds without being seen. This was entirely Sarah's work. She knew the island's geography intimately, knew where the cypress roots formed natural blinds, knew which way the wind typically blew in the afternoon and therefore from which direction sound would carry. She set them up on a narrow root shelf on the south side of the island, surrounded by thick water hyacinth and screened by a cypress so old its roots formed a wall of woody arches around them. From there they could see the cabin door and the small dock where a flat-bottomed boat was tied. The Calloway brothers were visible intermittently through the afternoon. Randall was exactly as the warrants described him, big, dark-bearded, with the careful, paranoid watchfulness of a man who had been running for a long time. Dennis was quieter, sat on the dock and fished with the blank look of someone who had stopped thinking very much about anything. Tyler, the youngest, sat apart from his brothers and did not fish and did not patrol. He sat on a log at the edge of the island and looked at the water with an expression that even at this distance read clearly as miserable. He wants to be done, Albert said quietly, close to Sarah's ear so the words were barely air. He is not committed to this. She nodded, her face close to his, and in the confined space of their hiding spot, he was very aware of her warmth and the smell of her hair and the absolute, focused calm she was projecting into what was objectively a very tense situation. If you can speak to the youngest one alone, she whispered, he might give up without a fight. Getting him alone is the problem, he murmured. He walks to the south point of the island every evening, she said. I have been watching. He stands there for about 15 minutes. His brothers cannot see the south point from the cabin. He turned to look at her. She was looking at the island with those measuring eyes, and she was right, he realized. She had only been watching for 3 hours and she had already identified this pattern. You watch for that specifically, he said. Patterns in behavior are a form of terrain, she said simply. You read them the same way. That evening, when the light was going golden and long across the water, Tyler Calloway walked to the south point of the island exactly as she had predicted. Albert moved through the water hyacinth in a wide arc, belly deep in water, moving so slowly that the surface barely rippled, the way she had showed him to move in the channel. He came up on the south point from the waterside, where the cypress trees screened him from the cabin, and he was standing behind Tyler Calloway before the young man knew he was there. Do not shout, Albert said very quietly. I am Deputy Albert Atkins, United States Marshal. I know you want this to be over. I need you to tell me what I need to know. Tyler Calloway turned around and Albert saw a young man who looked 5 years older than 24, hollowed out by months of running and fear and the accumulating weight of things he could not undo. He did not go for his weapon. He just looked at Albert for a moment with those empty, exhausted eyes. How many ways out of here do they know? Albert said. Just the North Channel, Tyler said, his voice barely above a whisper. The one we came in on. Where do they keep the weapons? Inside. Randall sleeps with his rifle. Dennis keeps his in the corner by the door. He hesitated. Randall is going to die before he surrenders. I want you to know that. He will not come peaceful. I know, Albert said. What about Dennis? Maybe, Tyler said. If Randall were already down, he follows Randall. Another hesitation. What happens to me if I help you? "That is not my decision to make," Albert said honestly. "But your cooperation will be part of the record, I can promise you that." He looked at the young man steadily. "And whatever else you have done, Tyler, I do not think you are as far gone as your brothers. I think you know the difference between where you are and where you want to be." Something in the young man's face broke just slightly at that. He was quiet for a moment. "Tomorrow morning," Tyler said, "Randall drinks. He has been drinking at night more than usual. By early morning he is slow. Dennis makes coffee outside on the dock around 7. That is when they are most separate." "All right," Albert said. "Go back before they notice you are gone." Tyler Calloway walked back to the cabin with the wooden steps of a man walking to his own sentence. Albert watched him go, then moved back through the water to where Sarah was waiting. She had heard enough of it. Her position had been close and the evening was quiet and voices carried. When he pulled himself back up onto their root shelf, she was already thinking. He could see it in the set of her face. 7 in the morning, he said. "I can create a distraction on the north side of the island at that time," she said. "Something that will make Dennis look in the wrong direction, give you the approach on the dock. You will be putting yourself in range of a man with a rifle." "I will be in the trees," she said, without particular concern. "I know these trees." He looked at her. In the fading light her face was all shadows and angles and that quality she had of absolute, settled certainty in herself and her terrain. He thought about the way she had pulled him out of the quicksand channel, with 90 seconds of precise instruction. He thought about the map on her wall, 6 years of accumulated wisdom about a place that nobody else fully understood. He thought about the way she had identified Tyler's pattern in 3 hours of observation. "Sarah," he said. "Do not tell me it is too dangerous," she said. "I was not going to," he said, though honestly he had considered it. "I was going to say that this is your operation as much as mine, and that whatever happens tomorrow, you should know I trust your judgment completely." She was quiet for a moment. The frogs and night birds filled the silence. "That is not something men usually say to me," she said, and her voice was slightly different than usual, not softer exactly but less armored. "Then the men you have known have not been paying attention," he said. The night stretched on around them, long and damp and full of the Flats' particular music. They kept watch in shifts, 2 hours each, because however confident they were in their plan, sleeping unguarded 20 yards from 3 wanted men was not something either of them was willing to do. During his watch, Albert sat with his back against the cypress root and the loaded Colt across his knees and thought about the choices that had brought him here. The 7 years of tracking, the long stretches of solitary country, the way he had been very good at his work and very alone in his life for a very long time. He thought about how those two things were not unrelated. When Sarah took her watch, he lay back on the moss and looked up through the cypress branches at the stars visible in thin strips above, and felt something settle in his chest that he had not felt in a very long time. It was not peace, exactly, not with 3 killers 20 yards away. It was more like the feeling of being in the right place, of circumstance and person and moment all aligning into something that had a quality of recognition to it. He slept. In the morning, the plan unfolded with the quiet efficiency of something that had been correctly designed. At 10 minutes to 7, Sarah slipped away through the water without a ripple. She moved through the swamp like she was part of it, which Albert had come to understand was not a metaphor or a poetic description, but a literal truth about what 6 years of intimate knowledge did to a person's relationship with a place. At 7, when Dennis Calloway came out of the cabin and walked to the dock with his coffee pot, a sound erupted from the north side of the island, a sequence of sharp cracks, almost but not quite like gunshots. The sound of dead cypress wood struck hard in rapid succession, a sound that Albert had not been able to identify until Sarah showed him how to make it the previous evening. It was the kind of sound that in the swamp could mean a dozen things, but in the current context, with paranoid men hiding from pursuit, it meant trouble from the north. Dennis Calloway's head came up sharply. He stood, looking north. He shouted something back at the cabin. He started moving along the island's north shore. Albert came out of the water onto the dock in 3 fast, silent steps. He had Randall Calloway's rifle out of his hands before the man was fully awake, and the Colt pressed against the side of his head, while Randall was still processing the transition from sleep to confrontation. "Do not," Albert said. Randall Calloway froze. His eyes were those of a man who had been waiting for this moment for a long time and hated that it had finally arrived. "Dennis," Randall shouted, or started to. "My partner is between Dennis and this door," Albert said, which was not entirely precise since Sarah's role did not extend to physically blocking Dennis, but the statement contained enough uncertainty to make Randall pause. "And Tyler has already made his choice. It is over, Randall. You know it is over." Randall Calloway was a hard, violent man, but he was also, under all of that, a man who understood reality. He had run for 3 months. He was in a swamp in East Texas. The lawman who had found him had done so by getting the best guide in the territory, and somewhere on the other side of the island Dennis was probably already looking at the wrong end of something dangerous. He put his hands up. When Albert came out of the cabin with Randall in irons, he found Sarah standing on the north shore with Dennis Calloway's rifle in her hands and Dennis himself sitting on a cypress root looking like a man who had stepped on a snake and was still figuring out what had happened. Tyler was standing near the dock, not in irons, looking like a man who had set down something very heavy. "The distraction worked," Albert said. "It always works," she said. "Men do not expect the swamp to make precise tactical noise." She was almost smiling. For the first time since he had met her, the expression reached something like warmth. The trip back out of the flats took 2 days with 3 prisoners in tow, and a flat-bottomed boat that Sarah had found cached on the east side of the island, precisely where she had predicted there would be one. Sheriff Pruitt's men were waiting at the east landing, as Armand Petty had apparently delivered the message exactly as instructed. The handover was efficient and professional. The Calloway brothers, Randall furious and silent, Dennis bewildered, Tyler with a look of cautious, fragile relief, were loaded on 2 horses for the ride back to Millhaven. Armand Petty was there at the landing, alive and well, and when he saw Sarah Dawson he said something quickly in French that made her shake her head in that way she had, not quite smiling, clearly fond of the boy regardless of her restraint. Sheriff Pruitt looked at Albert and then at Sarah and then at Albert again with the expression of a man trying to solve an arithmetic problem in his head. "You got them," he said. "We got them," Albert said with the specific weight of the pronoun. Pruitt looked at Sarah. She looked back at him with the exact same expression she had used when she first pointed a Henry rifle at Albert's ear, which was to say, a great deal of assessment and a moderate amount of warning. Pruitt, who was a man who knew when to let something go, elected to simply nod. The ride back to Millhaven was 4 hours. They rode side by side, not at the front with the prisoners and the sheriff's men, but a little back from the main group, and they talked more freely than they had been able to in the swamp, where every word had been measured against the need for silence. She asked about his work, what he had seen and where he had been, and he told her about the territory with the kind of specific, vivid detail that comes from genuine attention rather than performance. She told him about the flats in the way she had not talked about it before, not as operational information, but as a place she loved, the way the light changed in October when the water dropped and the cypress needles turned russet and gold, the morning when the migrating birds came through, and the sky above the channels was so full of wings it blocked the sun. He listened to her describe this place that had nearly killed him and felt it, through her words, as something genuinely beautiful. In Millhaven, there was the business of official reports and signed statements, and the formal process of arresting 3 wanted men, which took most of the remainder of the day. Through all of it Sarah was present, giving her account of events with the same precise, unemotional accuracy she brought to everything. And watching her in the formal context of official proceedings, Albert saw something he recognized. The way the sheriff and the other local men consistently addressed their questions just slightly past her, toward him, not because they doubted her account, but because of some deep, unconscious habit of deferring to the man in the room even when the most knowledgeable person was the woman standing right next to him. He did not let it stand. Every time it happened, he redirected explicitly. "She is the one who identified the channel disturbance. Ask her." Sarah Dawson navigated the entire approach. Her account is the authoritative one. He did not make a speech of it or turn it into a confrontation. He simply, consistently, in the flat, matter-of-fact tone of someone stating geographical facts, directed the proper acknowledgement where it belonged. She noticed. He could see that she noticed, though she said nothing and her expression did not change. And afterward, when the official business was done and they were standing in the dusty street outside the sheriff's office in the late afternoon, she looked at him for a moment. "You did not have to do that," she said. "Yes, I did," he said simply. She was quiet for a moment. The street was busy around them, horses and wagons and the ordinary commerce of a frontier town, and in the middle of all of it there was this stillness between the two of them, this collected, specific quiet. "I need to get back to the flats," she said. "The trap lines have been unattended for 3 days." "I know," he said. And then, because he had been forming this question in various versions throughout the entire ride back, and had not found a better way to say it, "Would you be willing to have dinner with me tonight before you go? There is, apparently, an establishment here that serves actual food. I would like to continue our conversation in a context that does not involve either quicksand or armed criminals." She studied him, that measuring, precise, entirely thorough look. "Yes," she said. "All right." The meal was at the one proper eating establishment in Millhaven, a place run by a woman named Mrs. Carver who produced excellent roasted chicken and made a cornbread that Albert suspected was the best he had ever had. They sat across from each other at a corner table and ate and talked for 2 hours. And what Albert discovered in those 2 hours was that Sarah Dawson's mind was as expansive and as interesting as her knowledge of the flats, that she had thoughts about botany and natural history, and the process of surveying and the future of the frontier that were original and sharp and worth following wherever they led. He told her things he had not told anyone in a long time. About Ohio, about the farm his parents had run, about the brother he had lost to a fever when they were teenagers, about the specific way the frontier had caught him young and never let him go, not as hardship but as something that answered a need in him that nothing else could answer. She listened with the full, active attention she brought to everything, and asked questions that were precise and perceptive. When the meal was done and the evening had gone fully dark, they walked out into the street and stood for a moment in the cool air. "You will write your report from Fort Worth," she said. "Yes," he said. "I will be a week on the road." "And then you will have another warrant to serve," she said. "Another trail to follow." "That is generally how it works," he said. She looked at him. He looked at her. The space between them was the particular kind of space that has a quality to it, a weight, that tells you something about what could be in it if someone moved. "I do not want to be someone you visit when you are passing through," she said. It was direct and clear, and showed the quality of a woman who had no interest in wasting time on ambiguity. "I have built my life in the flats. That is not something I am going to dismantle because a federal marshal is interesting company." "I'm not asking you to dismantle anything," he said. "I am asking if there is a possibility that what is between us is worth the inconvenience of the geography." She was quiet for a long moment. "I think there might be," she said, "but I need you to understand what my life is. The flats are my home and my work and my purpose. I am not looking for someone to rescue me from them. I am looking, if I am looking for anything, for someone who respects them the way I do." "I have spent 3 days in the Cypress Flats," he said, "and I can tell you with complete honesty that I have never seen any place on this earth that I understood less and respected more." He met her eyes. "And I have never met anyone whose knowledge and skill I have respected more either. If you will allow me to come back, I will come back, and it will not be to rescue you from anything." She looked at him for a long moment and then nodded once with the gravity of someone making a decision. "Come back," she said, "when you can." He came back 6 weeks later. He had no warrant for East Texas, but he invented a reason involving a fugitive supposed sighting that he had some conscience about but not enough to stop him. And he rode back into Millhaven, and then followed her markers through the Cypress Flats to her cabin on a gray November day when the water was up and the cypresses were turning. And she was exactly where he expected her to be, at her work table with the maps, adding new notations in her small, precise handwriting. She looked up when he came in. The expression on her face in that first unguarded moment told him everything he needed to know about whether she had been waiting for him. That visit lasted 4 days. He helped her with the trap lines, or tried to, under her patient and occasionally exasperated instruction, because trapping in a swamp environment was an extremely specific skill that he did not have and was not going to develop in 4 days. He carried things. He held things. He made coffee while she worked. In the evenings they sat by the fire and talked, and on the 4th evening, in the middle of a conversation about the migratory patterns of the birds that came through the flats in November, she leaned across the small table and kissed him. It was brief and deliberate and clear, like everything she did. "That is what that is," she said, with a tone that suggested she had been thinking about this for a while and had finally decided to stop thinking and start doing. "Yes," he said, and reached across the table and took her hand, and she let him, and that was that. The months that followed were complicated and often difficult in the practical sense and profoundly good in every other sense. He had work in other parts of the territory that he could not abandon. She had the flats, which she would not abandon. They wrote letters, long ones on both sides, hers dense with the specific details of her observations, and his full of the country he covered, and the things he saw. And the letters were a kind of continuous conversation that bridged the distance between visits. He came back 4 more times before winter ended, and 3 times in the spring, each visit a little more certain than the last, each conversation building on the ones before. She showed him more of the flats each time, deeper channels, seasonal flooded areas, the birds of April when the marsh wrens came back. He showed her, during one visit when she accompanied him partway out of the flats on a trip to Millhaven for supplies, how he tracked in open country, the language of bent grass and disturbed stone, and she watched with the same attentive precision she brought to everything and asked questions that were penetrating and immediate. They were, he thought, very good at learning from each other. That seemed important. In April, 6 months after he had ridden into the Cypress Flats for the first time and nearly drowned in a hidden channel, he came back to the cabin with no official purpose whatsoever and told her so. "No warrant," she said from the doorway. "No warrant," he said. She tilted her head. "Then why are you here?" "Because I need to ask you something," he said, "and I thought it was better done in person." She looked at him with that measuring quality and then stepped back to let him inside, which he had learned was her version of a very warm welcome. He had thought during the long ride from Fort Worth about how to say what he wanted to say. He had drafted several versions in his head and discarded them all because they sounded like things a man said when he was trying to manage a situation. And this was not a situation to be managed. This was Sarah Dawson, who had no patience for anything that was not straightforward, and what he wanted to say was straightforward. He sat down at her table. She sat across from him and waited. "I am 32 years old," he said. "I have been moving my entire adult life. Good work, honest work, but solitary. I have spent the last 6 months writing letters to a woman who lives in a swamp and counting the days between visits, and I have come to the conclusion that I would like to stop counting." He looked at her. "I am not asking you to leave the flats. I am asking if there is a version of this life where we are in it together, where I am the one who comes home to you." Silence. Outside the cabin, the flats made their spring sounds, birds and frogs and the gentle movement of water. "You would need to transfer your service," she said. "Fort Worth is too far for regular return." "Beaumont District," he said. I have already made inquiries. There is a need for a deputy out of Millhaven. A pause. It was a hypothetical inquiry. Nothing was committed. She looked at him for a long time. He waited because she always needed to think completely, and he had learned not to rush that. I will not be a conventional wife, she said. I will not stay in a house in town and keep a domestic schedule. The flats are my work and my research and my life. I know, he said. I'm not asking for conventional. I am asking you to understand that clearly, she said. Before you commit to something and then find out later that what you wanted was a woman who cooks your supper and waits for you. Sarah, he said quietly, the first time I tried to walk through your swamp without you, I nearly drowned in 3 feet of water. I have had the last 6 months to appreciate the precise, specific nature of what you do and who you are. I am not confused about either. He held her gaze. I love you because of your independence, not in spite of it. Because you are the most capable, intelligent, extraordinary person I have ever known. Because the flats are part of you and you are extraordinary. That is not something I want to change. She was very still. Something moved across her face, something that had the quality of a wall coming down, not dramatically, not all at once, but in the particular way of a woman who has been self-sufficient for a very long time and has just been offered something she has wanted without knowing she was allowed to want it. Yes, she said. All right. They were married in June of 1883 in Millhaven, in the small church that served the community, in a ceremony attended by Sheriff Prout, who managed a genuine smile, Mrs. Carver from the restaurant, who cried happily, and Armand Petty's family, who came from the south edge of the flats in their best clothes and brought fried catfish and cornmeal cake that was better than anything the church ladies had contributed. Sarah wore a dress she had apparently owned for some years, practical dark blue wool, and she wore it with the same direct ease she wore everything, and Albert thought he had never seen anyone look more themselves or more beautiful. Albert had transferred his commission to the Beaumont district and was operating out of Millhaven, which suited everyone. The work was real and necessary, and he was good at it, and he came home to the flats. He learned the flats gradually, over months and then years, the way a person learns anything worth knowing. Not all at once, not from a book, but step by step, mistake by careful corrected mistake, with Sarah as his guide in the most complete sense of the word. He learned to read water the way she did, imperfectly, but usefully. He learned which channels were safe in which seasons, learned the sound of the swamp when something was wrong versus when it was simply alive, learned to pole a flat-bottomed boat with something approaching her efficiency. He built an addition to the cabin. He built it the way she suggested, using cypress wood, raised above the flood line, with a window facing east so the morning light came through. She watched him work with an expression he had come to recognize as the one she wore when she approved of something but was not yet entirely sure she wanted to say so. When it was done, she walked through it and stood at the east window and looked out at the water and the cypress trees in the early light, and she said, "It is good," which from Sarah was a superlative. In the spring of 1884, she told him she was expecting their first child. She told him in the early morning, matter-of-factly, while she was making coffee, with the same tone she used to relay weather observations or seasonal water levels, and he sat down very suddenly in the nearest chair and looked at her with an expression that must have been extraordinary because she actually laughed. He had not heard her laugh very often. It was worth the expression. "Are you all right?" she said. "Yes," he said, and then said nothing else for a moment while something enormous happened in his chest. "Yes, I am very much all right." Their son was born in October of 1884, in the cabin, with the help of a midwife from Millhaven who had the good practical sense not to comment on living in a swamp, and who had delivered half the babies in 2 counties and was entirely equal to the task. Albert was not allowed in the room during the birth because Sarah informed him that his being there would not help anything and his anxiety would slow her down, which was the kind of clear-eyed assessment of the situation that he had come to expect from her, and which, in the moment, he found extraordinarily difficult to argue with. He waited outside on the bank of the channel in the October night, listening to the flats in the way she had taught him, and he heard the cry of his son for the first time across the water, and the sound went through him like light. They named him Ezekiel for her father, Zeke, in daily use. He was a solid, serious, curious child who seemed to have arrived with a natural affinity for the water and the trees, crawling toward the channel at every available opportunity, and requiring the installation of a small fence around the cabin's outer bank, which Albert built in 2 days while Sarah supervised and Zeke sat in the middle of the floor and regarded both of them with the evaluating expression that was unmistakably his mother's. Sarah's work continued. If anything, the presence of Albert and then of Zeke in the cabin enriched it, because Albert covered more of the flats himself now, on patrol and on survey, and he reported what he saw back to her, extending the range of her observations without either of them having to travel farther than was practical. The map grew. The notations multiplied. She had begun writing formal articles about swamp ecology and water surveying, corresponded with a naturalist at a university in New Orleans, and was in the early stages of something that was going to be, Albert suspected, a comprehensive published work on the Cypress Flats that would be cited by naturalists for decades. He said this to her one evening when Zeke was 2 and asleep in the back room, and they were sitting by the fire with the map between them. "That is a large claim," she said, but she was looking at the map in the way she looked at things she took seriously. "It is an accurate one," he said. She looked at him. "How do you know?" "Because it is comprehensive and original and based on better primary observation than anyone else has access to," he said. "Because you are the most rigorous and precise researcher I have ever encountered, and because the knowledge in those maps and notes is genuinely irreplaceable." He met her eyes. "I have read everything you have written. It is exceptional work." She looked at him for a long moment in the firelight, this woman he had come home to every evening for nearly 2 years, who had never in those 2 years stopped being exactly who she was, fierce and independent and brilliant and absolutely, completely herself, who had, he knew with the settled certainty of a man who has found the true coordinates of his life, changed every single thing about what home meant to him. "I am going to need a better table," she said, "for the writing." "I will build you one," he said immediately, "larger than the current one, with a north-facing window for good light, and shelves." "All of those things," he said. She nodded, as though this had settled a matter of some practical importance, and went back to her notes. He watched her work for a moment, her small, precise handwriting moving across the page, the firelight on her face, Zeke's quiet breathing from the back room, the flats alive and dark and deep outside, and felt the specific, sustained, abundant happiness of a man who has found exactly where he belongs and knows it. In the spring of 1886, their second child came. A daughter this time, which Zeke, 3 years old and fully invested in being the authority on everything, greeted with a long, assessing look not unlike his mother's finest specimens. They named her Nora, and she arrived in the world with an immediate and emphatic personality that made herself known from the first hour and did not moderate over time. Where Zeke was quiet and observing, Nora was bright and constant and interested in everything simultaneously, and the cabin that had been Sarah's solitary world, and then Albert and Sarah's world, and then the world of 3 became the world of 4 with a fullness that surprised Albert sometimes with its weight. The Calloway case had ended as Albert had privately expected. Randall Calloway was tried in Fort Worth in early 1883 and hanged for the murders of the postal inspectors. Dennis received 20 years in the federal penitentiary. Tyler Calloway, in recognition of his cooperation, received 5 years, and it was generally understood that the cooperation in question had been crucial to the arrest. He served 3 years, was released, and the last Albert heard he was working on a riverboat out of New Orleans, as far from criminal enterprise as geography could put him. Armand Petty grew up to be a skilled trapper, and eventually took over the family's trap line operation. He married a girl from Millhaven when he was 22, and his family brought catfish to the wedding. And on the day Zeke was born, they sent over a carved cypress wood rattle that Nora subsequently inherited and eventually gave to her own children in decades to come. The legal world of the Cypress Flats changed slowly over the following years, as it changed everywhere in the frontier territories, the old open country giving way to formal jurisdiction, surveyed land, established law. Albert was part of that change, a careful and fair part of it, he hoped, and he spent years working to ensure that the transition to formal law happened in ways that were just, that the Creole families who had worked the flats for generations were not simply displaced by it, that the people who knew the land had standing in the decisions made about it. Sarah fought that battle on the academic and scientific side, and she fought it with the thoroughness of someone who had documented the territory so comprehensively that her records became foundational evidence in every legal and scientific dispute about the flats that arose in those years. Her work, formally published in 1888 by a natural history press in New Orleans under the title A Survey of the Cypress Flats, Waterways, Flora, and Ecological Systems of the Texas-Louisiana Border Territory, by Sarah Dawson Atkins, became exactly what Albert had said it would be. The naturalist in New Orleans wrote her a letter that called it the most important regional ecological survey produced in the American South in the 19th century. She read this letter once, put it in her correspondence file, and told Albert about it over supper without particular elaboration. He knew what it meant to her because he knew her, and because he saw the way she held herself that evening, the specific quality of satisfaction in her face, the kind that comes from years of careful work being recognized as what it was. By the time Zeke was old enough to follow his parents through the channels on his own, at around 7 years old, he was already reading the water with a sureness that made experienced trappers stop and look. Nora, at 5, was more interested in the botanical drawings, and had been found on several occasions making her own sketches of swamp plants with the focused intensity of someone engaged in serious work. Albert watched his children in the flats and felt the particular joy of watching people become themselves in a place that was made for them. The cabin had been added to twice more, a second back room for the children, a proper study for Sarah with the large north-facing table and the shelves, and it had become less a cabin than a proper home, deeply rooted in the cypress root island it occupied, as much a part of the flats as the water itself. Visitors came, occasionally, naturalists and surveyors, and once a journalist from a New Orleans paper who wanted to write about the woman who had mapped the Cypress Flats. Sarah received him with the same measuring patience she had shown everyone, answered his questions precisely, and sent him back to Millhaven with more accurate information than he had arrived with and a much clearer understanding of what the flats were. Albert escorted the journalist out to the East Landing, and on the way, answered questions about what it was like to be married to Sarah Dawson. He thought about it genuinely, because it was worth thinking about genuinely. "She is the most capable person I know," he said. "She is the most honest person I know. She built something extraordinary in these flats before I arrived, and she has kept building it, and I have had the great good fortune to be part of that and to watch it. I am a better man for knowing her, a better tracker, a better marshal, a better observer of the world." He looked at the cypress trees overhead, the green-gold light filtering down. "And I love her more than I know how to say, which for a man who has seen a great deal of the world and been in my share of difficult situations, is saying something." The journalist wrote all of this down and printed it, and in the article it came out slightly more florid than Albert had said it, because journalists did that, but the substance of it was accurate, and Sarah, who read the article when Albert brought it back from Millhaven, said nothing about it for a long time, and then at the end of the evening said, "You should not have said all of that to a stranger." "Probably not," he agreed. A pause. "It was accurate, though," she said. "Yes," he said. "Entirely." She turned back to her notes. He watched her, and the fire, and the reflection of the fire on the water through the window, and felt that quality again that he had felt for the first time sitting in the mud at the edge of her swamp with the night coming on and the frogs singing. The quality of being exactly in the right place at the right time with the right person. The feeling that all of the movement and pursuit and long solitary stretches of his life had been a series of trails leading to this one arrival. In the autumn of 1889, on a morning when the cypress trees were turning gold, and the channels were low and clear, and the birds were beginning their migration south, Albert and Sarah sat on the bank outside the cabin before the children were awake and drank coffee and watched the water in the comfortable silence of people who have had 1,000 conversations and know that silence is also a conversation. And Sarah put her head briefly against his shoulder in that way she had that was rare and therefore meant everything. "You know what this place was before you came," she said. "Yours," he said. "Yes," she said. "Mine and only mine, and it was enough. I want you to know that. It was enough before." "I know," he said. "But this is better," she said, with the direct simplicity of a woman who had no patience for anything less than truth. "This is considerably better." He put his arm around her and she allowed it, which was its own kind of declaration, and they sat together in the morning light while the Cypress Flats woke around them. The water and the birds and the old cypress trees and the life they had built together, in the most alive and complex and extraordinary place that Albert Atkins had ever had the grace to nearly drown in. Zeke came out of the cabin 10 minutes later, barefoot, trailing a blanket, and immediately tried to climb down the bank to the water before Albert intercepted him without breaking the coffee hold. "Channel is up," Albert said. "I was just looking," Zeke said. "Looking is fine from the bank," Sarah said, without turning around. Zeke settled onto the bank between them, with the resignation of a boy who has learned that both his parents are paying attention at all times, which was a lesson that took him somewhat longer to learn than most lessons, but which had eventually taken hold. Nora appeared in the doorway behind them, carrying one of Sarah's botanical notebooks with the careful reverence of someone transporting something important, and said, "Mama, can I draw the morning flowers today?" "Yes," Sarah said. "Use the pencil, not the pen. The pen bleeds in the humidity." Nora disappeared back inside, apparently satisfied. Albert looked at the channel, gold and still in the morning light, and thought about the day 3 weeks after his arrival in the flats when Sarah had pulled him out of a hidden channel with 90 seconds of precise, calm instruction, and thought about how that moment, that exact moment of being completely out of his depth, and being met there not with judgment but with competence and unexpected kindness, had been the beginning of everything. He had been lost and she had known the way and she had chosen to show it to him, not because she had to, but because she had decided he was worth the trouble. He thought that was probably the truest definition of love he had ever encountered. Not the rescue, the choosing. "What are you thinking about?" she said, because she always knew when he was thinking about something specific. "The day I got stuck in the channel," he said. She turned to look at him. One eyebrow rose very slightly. "I was not stuck," he said, for form's sake. "I was in a temporary and precarious navigational situation." "You were stuck," she said, with the absolute flat certainty of a woman who does not revise history to comfort people. "I was stuck," he agreed. She looked at him for a moment, and the morning light was on her face, and those dark hazel eyes had the warmth in them that he knew was there even when she was not showing it, the warmth that was for him and for the children and for this place that she loved, and she said, "I am glad I went a look for you." "You went a look for me," he said. "I thought I wandered into your territory." "You did wander into my territory," she said. "But I saw your horse turn back at the edge of the safe ground and I knew someone had gone in the wrong direction. I followed." A pause. "I was not going to let someone die in my swamp over sheer stubbornness." He stared at her. "You were already tracking me." "You were making a great deal of noise," she said. "And you had been heading for the deep channel for half an hour. I was watching from the high route." He sat with this information for a moment, the complete recalibration of a foundational event. "So you found me," he said. Eventually, she said. You had already stepped into the channel by the time I could safely shout. Another 2 steps and I could not have done anything. She looked at the water. You read my trap markers, though. I did not expect that. That is the reason I put the rifle away. That is the reason, he said. You were the first person to ever read my markers without being shown them, she said. You were observing carefully. That was worth more than a badge. He looked at his wife in the morning light, this woman who had built a world out of knowledge and patience and fierce, quiet love for a place that most people were afraid of, who had let him into that world not because he had a warrant or an official title, but because he had looked at her work and seen it clearly. Sarah, he said. Albert, she said, in the tone she used when she knew he was about to say something she already knew. I love you, he said. I know, she said. I love you too. She turned back to the water with the settled ease of a woman who has said the truest thing and finds no need to add anything to it. Drink your coffee before it gets cold. He drank his coffee. The Cypress Flats shimmered in the morning light around them, alive and deep and full of the knowledge that she had spent her life accumulating and that he had been fortunate enough to be guided through, and the children were inside making whatever quiet morning trouble children make, and the water was gold and still, and the day was beginning. Everything was as it should be. Everything was, after all the trails and all the difficult country and the hidden channels, and the 3 weeks of pursuit and one very important moment in chest-deep water, when a woman with a pole had decided to pull him out rather than let him sink, exactly as it should be. He put his hand over hers where it rested on the bank beside him, and she turned her hand over and held his, and they sat together in the bright October morning, while the Cypress Flats went on being exactly what they had always been, wild and patient and extraordinary, the home they had both, in their different ways, been crossing difficult country to find.